Greetings all and welcome to week 8, in which we will be discussing some aspects of sociability in late Renaissance and early modern Florence and Tuscany more generally. We'll be reviewing, in a very broad fashion, the kinds of people who went about their business in this period and what it was they did for work or leisure and where these activities took place. Admittedly, we'll be focusing mostly on leisure activities as we want to get to the kind of heart of understanding what people did in their free time, how much free time they had, who even had access to that kind of luxury. We'll also see that in this period, an emerging nobility encouraged the development of courtly spectacle and also led to the increasing popularity of theater and what would become known as the Commedia dell'arte, as well as opera, which we did touch on again last week. We will also look at some of the more common forms of entertainment available to men and women who are not, again, part of the social elite, and where they passed those available hours of leisure. Under the rule of Ferdinando I and his son and grandson Cosimo II and Ferdinando II, the elite culture of the court and the intelligentsia, which sort of surrounded it and had a semi-parasitical relationship with it, really expanded as it never had before. The heirs of Cosimo, first Grand Duke of Florence, sought to demonstrate the permanence of their new rule with rather unmistakable external signs of power. I might point out just even these two portraits of Cosimo and his son Ferdinando are rather magnificent in their similarity and in their posturing. It sort of harkened back to that portrait that we've seen of Cosimo I, in which he's in a full suit of armor. In this case, however, both father and son also have a very large ruff which encircles the neck, which was very much the fashion in late 16th century and 17th century, right across the continent from Italy all the way to England. So it's an interesting and really rather uncomfortable, at least to our eyes, pairing between kind of this claim to a military prowess and a military power, and then also the sort of refinement of the courtly ruff that leads up just to sort of placed right on top of this very external claim to power. Also, these suits of armor would have been ceremonial, and they were, as you can tell, extremely detailed and extremely expensive. So what the Medici court becomes about, really, in the 17th century is depicting, by any means possible, the permanence of their reign, of their rule, because they are, again, relative newcomers to the European stage. And also as how they get comfortable into that role and how they maintain that power throughout the 17th century, using really the court and these external trappings of spectacle and power to sort of overawe not just the people who are immediately around them, but also to send a message to other rulers in Europe at the time. And one of the other ways that they did this was by extending their power on the ground, quite literally, by expanding the villas that they already owned, and by buying up other palaces across the countryside. So these would be places for them to retreat, so which certainly, if we remember Francesco, he was very fond of Villa Pratolino. But it was also a place that their court could follow them should they care to go hunting or spend time sort of meandering around the exquisite gardens of the Villa Pratolino or the Villa di Castello. And the entire complex of Medici palaces, and there are many, have now been protected as a World Heritage UNESCO site. And many of them are still visitable. So another way that they continue, of course, which is by now a time-honored manner of consolidating power. So another way they managed to really exercise, I would say, their both their wealth and their legitimacy as rulers, again, is by patronizing artists. So commissioning frescoes, for example, to depict Medici victories, or statues such as Giambologna's massive equestrian bronze that is still in the Palazzo della Signoria. And this serves to remind Florentines of the legitimacy of their claim to the throne, that they also have great feats in the past. They have obtained their position not only by inheritance but by military victory, if you were. And they also were sort of on this continual PR campaign, if you'd like, to remind not only everyday Florentines, but also the new nobility that the Medici were really here to stay. In Florence, the nobility themselves became ever more dependent on the Grand Duke, and they were obliged to pay court at Palazzo Pitti. So again, it was here that the Grand Duke and his advisors could keep an eye on the nobles and manipulate them in a similar manner as Louis XIV would later do at his really very cramped but extremely opulent palace at Versailles. So for those of you who don't have any familiar with Versailles or with the French style of rulership, Versailles is built at the end of the 17th century by Louis XIV as a way really to keep an eye on everyone who is in his very extended court. It's a much, much larger court than the one that is at Florence. And he does this by essentially obliging everyone with a noble title who wants to really get any sort of royal favors whatsoever to go and live with him in Versailles, which is very close to Paris. And they're notoriously cramped quarters. It's really not. It's hot in the summer. It's cold in the winter. But it's a good way to keep an eye on everyone. And while you don't have nobles cohabiting in Palazzo Pitti, for example, in the same way that you do at Versailles, it still serves as the sort of nerve center of the court and of Medici power at this time. Right, so we're dealing again with a different sort of period of Florentine history. We've entered a different stage also in the development of European states. It's in the 17th century that you start to see the emergence of nation states, boundaries, as, for example, with France and England, that seem a little more familiar to our eyes. And of really rising French and English fortunes as the great Spanish Empire gradually succumbs under the weight of trying to maintain so vast and so militarized a dominion in the New World. Although it was too early for many on the continent to know it, the Spanish Empire had passed its zenith. The Medici, for the moment at any rate, continued, however, to reinforce their close relationship with Spanish powers by carrying on a tradition of Grand Dukes marrying Spanish consorts. Ferdinando's son, for example, Cosimo II, married the Habsburg Duchess Maria Maddalena. So there are these continual reinforcing of political ties through marriage, which are common across the continent, of course, in the period.